Previously in the complete creation.
So, congratulations! The plant and animal matter that you eat is all radioactive. And you are what you eat, so you are radioactive too. Welcome back. Thank you for joining me once again. We've been discussing carbon-14 dating and the surprising implications to the debate about the age of the Earth, and specifically the surprising places in which we find large amounts of carbon-14 where it should not be, demonstrating that the geological record is actually young and not even millions of years old, let alone billions. As I saw this past week in response to the past several parts of the complete creation, some die-hard old Earth advocates were crying contamination with regards to carbon-14 found in fossils. If a dinosaur bone can become contaminated with excessive carbon-14, then so can King Tutankhamun's mummy, or any archaeological artifacts which have been dated using carbon-14. Are you suggesting that archaeologists have been using a broken dating system for decades? Because the system they developed specifically accounted for and removed contamination from the samples. Frankly, to claim it's contamination is a foolish argument that demonstrates you do not understand how carbon-14 dating works, nor how little contamination is even available. Another common argument the anti-creationists have put forth is that we don't use carbon-14 dating for samples millions of years old. Well, first of all, that isn't even an argument. You just tacitly admitted that you have already predetermined the age of the sample in question by means other than radiodating. So you have just exposed that you are quite hasty to reject any form of radiodating for any reason. Well, if you are so quick to preemptively reject these dates, why on earth should I ever embrace the old ages you propose? Another very common argument is that the samples in question, and fossils in particular, do not have carbon in them. They claim that the bones or logs have been fossilized, so the original biomatter has been replaced with minerals which do not have carbon-14 in them. Therefore, any carbon-14 found in the fossil is clearly contamination. This argument, too, is based on gross ignorance of the topic. For starters, there is so much carbon-14 that it cannot be explained as contamination. To address the second point in that argument, let's crack open a bone under the microscope to see what we can learn. This is allegedly 67 million years old. What you are looking at here is basically dinosaur meat. Still stretchy and pliable. Obviously, lots of material here to carbon date, and without even running the tests, I'm pretty sure the radiocarbon date will disagree with the 67 million year old age assigned to that dinosaur bone. This was a bone from a Thescelosaurus spine, and this was one of the examples provided in Creation Research Society's Echoes of the Jurassic DVD, hosted by David Reeves, and I highly recommend you get a copy of the DVD from creationresearch.org. That DVD was the result of the iDinosaur project. the iDino research project also led to this special edition of the Creation Research Society Quarterly magazine that I've been referencing so much. What was the iDino project? Well, iDino is an acronym for Investigation of Dinosaur Intact Natural Osteotissue, or in layman's terms, dinosaur meat, bone, and tissues still intact and preserved today. Let's come back to the Nelson and Thomas paper. We discussed the various plants they had carbon dated, which were not fossilized at all. They were simply called fossil because they were deemed millions of years old by the evolutionary time scale. Now, fossil fruits, of which I have one here. This was one of those canisters that Vance cracked open and had me sniff. Why? Because the fruit, commonly found in a coal seam in Germany, is so fresh I can run my fingernail into the fruit. I can cut it with a knife, and it even still gives off a fruity aroma that can be detected by your nose or really expensive lab equipment. I would dare say there is original plant matter still in that fossil, wouldn't you? Now, the Axel Heiberg wood, which was so well preserved, you can cut it with a handsaw, and the native Inuit would burn it. Fossil wood from the dinosaur bone beds of Alberta were just like peat. Soft, well preserved. The wood samples from Czechoslovakia were carbonized, but very much still containing original woody material and assigned an evolutionary age of 290 million years old. Yet it had so much carbon-14 in it, it returned an age of less than 50,000 years old. But now, take a look down the list and notice how many samples from fossil animals were also tested. Fossils like a paddlefish from the world-famous Green River Formation. I think just about every fossil collector has fossils from the Green River Formation, and they are often spectacularly preserved fossils, usually fossil fishes. As Thomas and Nelson point out in their paper, they specifically included a couple of Green River Formation fossils because some of those fossils have even shown preservation of soft body parts like these fish on display in the Big Valley Creation Science Museum in Big Valley, Alberta. If you get the chance, do stop in and visit. Even the eyes were preserved in all of these fossil fish on the entire slab. But also, preserved proteins had been found in the skin of a fossil reptile from the Green River Formation. And in the case of the Green River fossil paddlefish, it still had preserved cartilage that they managed to remove from the fossil. Now, that fossil is on display in the new ICR Discovery Center for Science and Earth History in Dallas, Texas. You should go visit that museum when you get the chance. So, Nelson and Thomas took samples from a couple of Green River Formation fossils, assigned an evolutionary age of 49 million years, which returned carbon-14 ages of 26,110 years and 33,530 years old. So, which age is the correct one? 26,000, 33,000, or 49 million? As I previously pointed out, there are several dinosaurs in that list from Nelson and Thomas. This first hadrosaur bone from the North Dakota Cretaceous Hell Creek Formation is alleged to be 66 million years old, yet showed no permineralization in the interior. Its original bone. Now, this may come as a surprise to some, but That is actually quite common in the fossil record. For example, in 1996, the former curator of the Royal Tyrrell Museum in Drumheller, Alberta, Canada, Dr. Philip Curie, co-authored a children's book with Eva Koppelhaus. They made some surprising acknowledgments in the book. Bones do not have to be turned into stone to be fossils, and usually most of the original bone is still present in a dinosaur fossil. In fact, there were a great many examples they could have cited at that time, but they specifically wrote about this one. A more spectacular example was found on the north slope of Alaska, where many thousands of bones lack any significant degree of permineralization. The bones look and feel like old cow bones, and the discoverers of the site did not report it for 20 years because they assumed they were bison, not dinosaur bones. The bones were not at all permineralized. They were mistaken for bison bones. 3 creation researchers flew to Alaska specifically to examine this bone bed and documented their story in the book, The Great Alaskan Dinosaur Adventure, written in 1998, that you can get from the Answers in Genesis website and at the Creation Museum and Ark Encounter. The point being, contrary to the claims of the skeptics, in pretty much all cases of fossil dinosaur bones, some or all of the original bone material is still there. And sometimes that's all there is. There is no mineralization. It is raw, original bone preserved even to today. So here's another example of a dinosaur bone for which you are hard-pressed to detect any mineralization. This one is now in the collection of the Quebec Creation Science Association and was one of the bones Nelson and Thomas had carbon dated. Hey, look at that bone. And if you catch one of the many events hosted by ACS, you just might get to see that bone in person. If you ask real nice and maybe bribe him a little, Lawrence Tisdale might even let you hold it. That bone came from the Alberta dinosaur bone beds and returned a radiocarbon age of 32,770 years old. So Thomas and Nelson commented on the pristine, non-permineralized state of several of their samples, including this hadrosaur bone. Now, for a couple of dinosaur bone samples, including this one, they did something very interesting. They took a sample from deep in the interior, which you can see them doing here. Then they also took a sample from the outside of the bone. The interior sample returned a radiocarbon age of 20,850 years old, while the outside of the bone returned a radiocarbon age of 28,790 years old. So, which age is the correct age? So besides getting 2 different ages from the same bone, different by 28%, you'll notice that these radiocarbon readings create havoc for the bogus contamination argument. How is it that the interior of the bone had more than 2.5 times more carbon-14 than the outside of the bone? Put it another way, if it was contamination, all that carbon-14 had to somehow work its way into the interior of the bone through the outside, somehow collecting magnitudes more carbon-14 on the inside than the outside. It makes no sense from a contamination perspective. But as you can see, they also did the same trick with the Triceratops horn samples. We're going to take a closer look at that absolutely spectacular find in just a moment, but at the suggestion of Hugh Miller, Nelson and Thomas asked the carbon-14 labs to get 2 measurements from the Triceratops horn, one of the bulk horn matter and another of isolated bone apatite. Now, apatite is basically the mineral portion of the bone, which is made up of carbonated hydroxyapatite. So it has carbon in it. Vance Nelson and I were in upstate New York quite a few years ago, and my good friend Joe Taylor from the Mount Blanco Fossil Museum in Texas was giving a talk on his work with fossil bones. He mentioned bone apatite in his lecture, and everyone in the audience started chuckling. And Joe was like, "What? What's so funny?" And the audience started calling out, "It's bon appetit!" Joe just responded with, "Well, that's not how we say it in Texas." It was too funny. Anyway, Hugh Miller had suggested Thomas and Nelson obtain 2 different tests on the Triceratops horn. So they did. The bulk horn returned a radiocarbon age of 33,570 years, while the bioapatite returned a radiocarbon age of 41,010 years old. Now, both samples were from the core of the horn, but the bulk bone had 2.5 times more carbon-14 than the bioapatite. This is very significant for a multitude of reasons, not the least of which Vance and Brian bring up in their paper. The greater age for our bioapatite fraction resembles the PMC proportions in modern bone fractions. So in other words, if you were to crack open one of your bones and process 2 carbon-14 tests exactly like they did here, this ratio of the bulk bone having 2.5 times more carbon-14 than your bone apatite would be a dead ringer match. This demonstrates the carbon-14 is not contamination, because if it was, the amounts of carbon-14 in both samples would be pretty close to the same. Instead, the ratio matches what is collected by the bone building processes. So, about that Triceratops horn. That Triceratops horn was a very famous fossil find provided by the Creation Research Society. You see, many moons ago, Dr. Mary Schweitzer boldly published where no paleontologist had dared to publish before, and showed these pictures in the journal Science. Now, I'll give you a few seconds to guess what it is you are looking at here, and I'll give you a big hint. You are looking through a microscope. You are looking at Tyrannosaurus rex blood vessels, complete with red blood cells. You are looking at dinosaur blood. Mary Schweitzer and team were retrieving a T-Rex leg bone from the dinosaur bone beds of the Hell Creek Formation in Montana, and the bone was too big to fit in the helicopter. Boy, I wish I had their budget. Regardless, they broke the bone in 2 in order to make it fit. Now, this may sound like sacrilege, and the truth is we don't like to do that when excavating fossil dinosaurs, but you often have to make a decision to break a dinosaur bone in the field. The bones are typically all broken up already anyway, so you try to break them up as clean as possible to make reconstruction as easy as possible and with as little loss of material as possible. At any rate, when they broke the bone open, strange, soft material was exposed in the inner bone. So here's the very bone on display in the Museum of the Rockies in Bozeman, Montana. If you get the chance to visit, do so. So the thing is, while Schweitzer's paper made a pretty big splash in the news, she was not the first to discover such a thing. Not by a long, long shot. In fact, it wasn't even her first paper on the topic. 11 years prior, in a special publication by the Paleontological Society, she showed this photograph looking into a T-Rex blood vessel loaded with red blood cells. So that very famous Triceratops horn I just mentioned, guess what they found in there? That's right, blood vessels with copious red blood cells. The red blood cells even have that subtle bowl shape to them. In 1998, Palicki et al. Found blood vessels with red blood cells in a tarbosaur dinosaur, alleged to be 80 million years old. Now, in response to all of these scientists finding blood vessels in fossils where there should be no blood vessels left, some other scientists had suggested that, oh, no. These aren't blood vessels. These are tubes of biofilm made by modern bacteria. So, Palicki went to work and published a follow-up paper in the journal PLOS ONE in 2016 and examined blood vessels found in reptile fossils from the Triassic, dated at around 240 million evolutionary years and considered well before the time of the dinosaurs in the evolutionary column. Not only was this finding of preserved blood vessels spectacular, the vessels were so well preserved they were able to identify the biological compounds making up the tubes and affirm that they matched blood vessels and not biofilms. But the first documentation I've been able to dig up so far is from 1907, so 114 years ago. A book written in German with a title almost as long as the book itself. And I must give a shout out to several of my Facebook friends who helped me in translation of the original paper. Thanks especially to Peter and Fred. Thank you for all your time and help. As it was, we uncovered not just a significant historical and paleontological find, but a historical blunder that would affect researchers towards the end of the century. During his impressive and exhaustive studies of the bone structures preserved in multiple fossils, Adolf Seitz showed microphotographs of blood vessels and red blood cells found in an iguanodon dinosaur bone. Blood vessels and red blood cells, exactly where you would expect them in the bone. Today, that iguanodon would be assigned an age of probably 122 million evolutionary years old. And yet, here were blood vessels and red blood cells so well preserved, they even still had their reddish color, according to Seitz. Seitz was quoted in 1923 in Moody's book on paleopathology. Moody brought up Seitz's work because Moody himself had found the exact same thing in an Apatosaurus metatarsal bone that he himself excavated from the Como dinosaur beds of Wyoming in 1906. He noted some ovoid bodies arranged around the periphery of vascular spaces and Haversian canals, which looked remarkably like blood corpuscles. He remained skeptical of what he had found, however, for two reasons. First, because of what he thought Seitz had written. He provides a translation of what Seitz wrote about the red blood cells. Professor Solederer of Erlangen declares that the bodies are not of plant origin, spores, and by polarization it is determined that the bodies resemble somewhat crystalline concretions. So Moody spent a great deal of time basically writing off his own observations of preserved red blood cells because he thought Seitz had written off his own observations of preserved red blood cells as being merely concretions. Secondly, Moody was an expert in pathology. He emphasized the impossibility that red blood cells could be preserved for 122 million years. I totally agree. It is absolutely impossible for red blood cells to be preserved for 122 million years. But notice, Moody never said the quiet part out loud. Maybe this is powerful evidence that the dinosaur isn't 122 million years old. However, Moody was operating on a mistaken translation of the Seitz paper. Seitz was actually emphasizing that everything else was ruled out and that the only possibility that remained was that he was looking at red blood cells, even with their red color still preserved. Here's the original German and the more correct translation into English. Professor Dr. Solerator explains that these discs are absolutely no part of any botanical body, spore, and through polarization it could be ruled out that these bodies are crystalline concretions, geological, so that the only remaining impression or assumption is that we are dealing here with fossil blood vessels. The partial fulfillment of the vessel give indeed the impression of a clot filling up the vessel or a partial thrombus. At the end, there were multiple accumulations of reddish crystals at the vessel walls, which are similar to hematoid crystals and which substantiate the given impression or assumption further. Now, unfortunately, I am out of time for this segment, so we'll have to pick this up in the next lecture. This mistranslation will have a surprising significance, as you'll see for yourself, if you join me in the next lecture.
Coming up in the next Complete Creation.
So CRS went to the Glendive dig site and struck gold. They found and excavated a Triceratops horn, the first bone collected for the iDino project. And Mark Armitage reached into the inside hollow of the horn and pulled out entire sheets of original bone cells. The sheets were so well preserved, they were still stretchy, just like the T-Rex meat that Schweitzer and her team had found. All of this with no preparation to the fossil. No acid solutions, no preservers, nothing.
You can catch the entire series in a variety of ways. You can watch the show online at www.completecreation.org or www.genesisweek.com. You can also purchase the Complete Creation series in full high definition on Blu-ray or video on demand at completecreation.org. Or support the Miracle Channel with a monthly tax-deductible donation and access the entire Complete Creation series in high definition through Corco, Miracle Channel's video-on-demand service. We need your support to keep this program on the air. So please pray for us. And if you wish to financially support the program, Canadians can make a tax-deductible donation to Core Ottawa, Canada North Post Office Box 72075, Ottawa, Ontario, Canada, K2K2P4. Or you can make a donation via PayPal online at ianjuby.org/donations. And thank you for your support.